I sensed my wife planning to divorce me for money, so I secretly moved our fortune. 6 months later, she came crawling back when her affair partner fled with her credit cards maxed out. What started as small changes in Grace's behavior eventually revealed a calculated betrayal that nearly cost me everything I'd worked for. I thought I knew the woman I'd been married to for 6 years, but people can surprise you in the worst possible ways. Grace and I had what everyone called the perfect marriage. We'd been together for 8 years total, married for 6 of those, living in our comfortable suburban Dallas home that we'd bought 3 years ago when my software development career really took off. I worked remotely for a tech company while she managed a trendy boutique downtown, and we'd fallen into this really nice routine of weekend wine tastings and exploring hiking trails around Texas. Our friends always said we were the couple they aspired to be: financially stable, genuinely happy, planning our future together with the kind of careful consideration that builds lasting relationships. About 8 months ago, everything started shifting in ways that felt subtle at first but became impossible to ignore. Grace began checking her phone obsessively during our morning coffee ritual, something that had always been our sacred time to connect before starting our days. She installed privacy screens on all her devices and started angling them away from me whenever notifications came through. The woman who used to share every detail of her boutique operations suddenly became secretive about her daily activities, brushing off my questions with vague responses about busy vendor meetings and complicated inventory issues that apparently required her full attention. These mysterious vendor meetings started requiring her to dress in outfits I'd never seen before, expensive designer pieces that seemed way beyond what her boutique budget should allow. She'd return home with shopping bags from high-end stores, claiming everything was business research for upcoming seasonal collections. When I asked to see what she'd bought, she'd wave me off saying it was all boring work stuff I wouldn't understand. The Grace I married had always been excited to show me her latest finds and get my opinion on styling choices. More concerning was how she began redirecting our conversations away from anything involving future plans. Our European anniversary trip that we'd been planning for months suddenly became too stressful to think about right now. Our ongoing discussions about starting a family, something we'd both wanted for years, got dismissed with comments about bad timing and needing to focus on her career growth. She stopped participating in our weekly game nights with friends, claiming she was too tired or had early morning obligations that never seemed to materialize. The emotional distance felt like watching someone slowly disappear while still sharing the same house. Grace started criticizing my career choices in ways she never had before, suggesting I wasn't ambitious enough for someone my age and questioning whether I was really maximizing my potential in the tech industry. These comments came out of nowhere and stung because she'd always been supportive of my work-life balance and the stability my position provided for both of us. She'd make offhand remarks about other couples we knew, specifically mentioning how successful their husbands were and how they could afford luxury vacations and expensive restaurants without worrying about budgets. When I pointed out that we were doing well financially and could afford nice things too, she'd roll her eyes and mutter something about me not understanding what real success looked like. The woman who used to brag about my programming skills to her friends was now acting like my 6-figure salary was somehow inadequate. She started comparing me unfavorably to men in her social circle, mentioning how this person's husband had just gotten promoted or that person's boyfriend had started his own business. It felt like she was building a case against our relationship, collecting evidence of my supposed shortcomings to justify something I couldn't quite identify yet. Our physical intimacy decreased dramatically during this period, and when I tried to initiate conversations about what was bothering her, she'd deflect with complaints about being tired or stressed from work. The boutique that had always been her passion project suddenly became this overwhelming burden that consumed all her energy and attention, leaving nothing for our marriage or our shared goals. Grace's emotional withdrawal became impossible to ignore as she systematically dismantled the foundation of our relationship. She stopped participating in our weekly game nights with friends, claiming she had early morning meetings that required her to get to bed early, but I'd often find her scrolling through her phone until well past midnight. When our friends asked where she was, I found myself making excuses that became increasingly hard to believe. Grace is really focused on expanding the boutique right now, I'd say, while wondering if I was trying to convince them or myself that our marriage was still intact. Her criticism of my career intensified in ways that felt calculated and deliberate. During a dinner with her college roommate and her husband, Grace made pointed comments about how some people were content with just getting by, while others had the drive to build real wealth. "David's comfortable with his little programming job," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "but some of us want more from life than just comfortable." The sting of being dismissed in front of people we'd known for years was bad enough, but the way she said it felt rehearsed, like she'd been practicing these put-downs for maximum impact. Around this time, Grace began pressuring me to consolidate our financial accounts in ways that seemed innocuous at first but raised my suspicions. We'd always maintained separate investment portfolios and retirement accounts while sharing our checking and savings for household expenses. Suddenly, she was pushing for us to combine everything for better tax efficiency and easier financial planning. "We should really get organized," she'd say, spreading financial documents across our kitchen table. "My boutique accountant says married couples should consolidate everything to maximize deductions." When I suggested we consult with my financial advisor first, she'd get irritated and accuse me of not trusting her business judgment. The breaking point came during what should have been a romantic dinner at our favorite steakhouse downtown. Grace excused herself to take a call, claiming it was an urgent vendor issue that couldn't wait. I watched her pace outside the restaurant windows, gesticulating animatedly while speaking to whoever was on the other end. When she returned 15 minutes later, she seemed flustered and distracted, barely touching the expensive meal she'd insisted we order. Later that night, I realized I'd been subconsciously straining to catch fragments of her conversation, and what I'd heard didn't sound like business at all. Phrases like, "the timeline is perfect," and "he'll never see it coming" echoed in my mind as I lay awake wondering what exactly Grace was planning. Her sudden interest in our prenuptial agreement details sent genuine alarm bells ringing in my head. We'd signed a fairly standard prenup before our wedding, mostly to protect the small inheritance I'd received from my grandmother and to establish that any business either of us started would remain separate property. Grace had been completely supportive of this arrangement originally, saying it was smart and practical for both of us. Now she was asking detailed questions about specific clauses and whether certain assets would be considered community property under Texas law. "I'm just trying to understand our financial picture better," she'd explain when I questioned her sudden legal curiosity, but her timing felt suspicious given all the other changes in her behavior. The late nights at the boutique became more frequent and less believable as weeks passed. Grace would text me around 6 saying she had to work late on inventory or meet with potential investors, but when I decided to surprise her with dinner one evening, I discovered the store had been dark and locked up for hours. The parking lot was empty, and according to the neighboring shop owner, Grace had left around 4 that afternoon. When I confronted her about it later, she claimed she'd gone to a coffee shop to work on business plans and must have forgotten to mention the change in location. Her explanation felt rehearsed and hollow, delivered with the kind of defensive tone that suggested she'd been preparing for this exact question. Grace's increasingly suspicious behavior finally pushed me past the point of giving her the benefit of the doubt. I'd always been someone who trusted first and questioned later, but the accumulating evidence of deception was impossible to ignore any longer. After spending several sleepless nights weighing my options, I made the decision to hire a private investigator through a referral from my attorney brother-in-law in Houston. The choice felt like a betrayal of our marriage vows, but Grace's behavior had already crossed that line months ago. The private investigator, a former Dallas police detective named Rodriguez, began surveillance within a week of our initial consultation. His first report arrived via encrypted email 3 days later, and the contents confirmed my worst suspicions while revealing details I'd never imagined. Grace had been frequenting upscale hotels and restaurants throughout Dallas during her supposed work hours, always in the company of the same well-dressed man who appeared to be in his late 30s. The photographs showed them holding hands across candlelit tables, embracing in hotel lobbies, and entering rooms together at establishments that cost more per night than Grace's weekly boutique income. Rodriguez's investigation expanded beyond simple surveillance to include digital forensics that revealed the depth of Grace's deception. Using software to recover deleted browser history from our shared laptop, He discovered Grace had been researching divorce attorneys for months, specifically focusing on firms that specialized in maximizing asset division for wives. She'd bookmarked articles about Texas community property laws and had even started preliminary paperwork for several different legal firms, apparently shopping around for the most aggressive representation she could find. More disturbing was the evidence of secret financial maneuvering that Grace had already begun. Rodriguez uncovered applications for credit cards in her name only, accounts I'd never known existed despite our supposedly transparent financial arrangement. She'd been systematically documenting our assets, photographing important documents, and building what appeared to be a comprehensive portfolio of everything she believed she'd be entitled to in divorce proceedings. The level of premeditation was staggering and made me realize I'd been living with a stranger who'd been planning my financial destruction for months. Armed with this information, I immediately contacted my brother-in-law Marcus, who practiced family law in Houston and had warned me years ago about protecting assets in community property states like Texas. Marcus explained that timing would be crucial for any defensive measures I wanted to take, and that I needed to act quickly while maintaining absolute secrecy about my knowledge of Grace's plans. The goal isn't to hide assets illegally, he explained during our emergency meeting, but to restructure ownership in ways that protect what you brought into the marriage and what you've earned through your individual efforts. The asset protection strategy Marcus recommended involved creating a family trust managed by my retired banker father, who lived in Austin and had extensive experience with financial instruments and estate planning. This approach would allow me to legally transfer ownership of certain investments and properties into the trust while maintaining beneficial interest, effectively removing them from the community property pool that Grace seemed so confident about claiming. The process required careful documentation to establish that these transfers were legitimate financial planning decisions rather than attempts to defraud a spouse during divorce proceedings. Over the following weeks, I began systematically photographing and copying every important financial document in our house, creating secure digital backups of bank statements, investment portfolios, property deeds, and insurance policies. I opened a safety deposit box at a different bank and stored physical copies of everything along with detailed records of my separate property and inheritance documentation. The work felt like preparing for war while living with the enemy, maintaining normal conversations about weekend plans while secretly planning for the battle I knew was coming. The most challenging aspect was transferring our jointly owned real estate investments and my substantial cryptocurrency portfolio into the family trust without arousing Grace's suspicion. My father helped coordinate the complex paperwork through his banking contacts, ensuring every transaction was properly documented and legally sound. We structured the transfers to appear as routine estate planning rather than defensive maneuvering, spreading them across several weeks to avoid creating obvious patterns that might alert Grace or her future attorneys to what was happening. 6 months after I'd begun my protective measures, Grace finally revealed her hand in the most casual, devastating way imaginable. I was sitting at our kitchen table on a Sunday morning, reading the news on my tablet while drinking coffee from the mug she'd given me for our 3rd anniversary. Grace walked in wearing the silk robe I'd bought her for Christmas, poured herself coffee with the same routine we'd shared for years, then sat across from me and dropped a bomb that would have destroyed my financial future if I hadn't been prepared. "David, we need to talk about something important," she said, her voice carrying a tone I'd never heard before, confident, almost businesslike, completely devoid of the warmth that had characterized our relationship for 8 years. She reached into her robe pocket and pulled out a manila envelope that she placed carefully on the table between us. "I've filed for divorce. These are the papers you need to review." The shock I displayed wasn't entirely feigned, even though I'd been expecting this moment for months. Having your spouse casually announce the end of your marriage over Sunday morning coffee while wearing the gifts you'd given her felt surreal and cruel in ways I hadn't anticipated. Grace watched my reaction with what appeared to be satisfaction, like she was enjoying the power dynamic of catching me completely off guard. "I've hired Jessica Morrison from Morrison, Blake and Associates," she continued, naming one of Dallas's most prominent family law firms. "She specializes in complex asset division and has assured me that Texas community property laws will ensure I receive exactly what I deserve from our marriage." The way she emphasized what I deserve, made it clear this wasn't about fair division but about maximizing her financial gain from our relationship. Grace then proceeded to outline her demands with the confidence of someone who believed she held all the cards. She wanted half of what she calculated to be our $2.3 million estate, including our house, my company stock options, my cryptocurrency investments, and ongoing spousal support despite her own successful business. Jessica says I'm entitled to half of everything you've earned during our marriage, plus compensation for the career opportunities I've sacrificed to support your success, she explained, as if she'd memorized talking points from attorney consultations. The irony of her claiming to have sacrificed career opportunities for my success wasn't lost on me, considering I'd discovered her affair and her months of planning my financial destruction. But I maintained the devastated husband act, asking questions about counseling and whether this decision was final. David, I've moved beyond trying to save something that clearly isn't working, she replied with practiced sympathy. We want different things from life, and I deserve to be with someone who matches my ambitions and can provide the lifestyle I've always envisioned. Her mention of deserving someone who could provide a better lifestyle confirmed what I'd suspected about her affair partner's role in this decision. Grace had clearly been promised a more luxurious future by whoever she'd been seeing, and our divorce settlement would fund her transition to that new life. The calculated coldness with which she discussed dismantling our shared life while sitting in the kitchen where we'd planned our future together revealed a side of her personality I'd never seen before. When I asked for time to process everything and find legal representation, Grace graciously agreed to mediation rather than immediate court proceedings. I think we can handle this civilly, she said, already standing to clear away our coffee cups as if we just discussed weekend plans instead of the end of our marriage. Jessica says most couples in our situation can reach reasonable agreements without dragging things through expensive litigation. Her confidence was absolute, built on the assumption that I had no idea what was coming and no way to protect myself from her legal strategy. The private investigator's expanded report on Grace's affair partner arrived 2 days after she served me with divorce papers, and the details were both illuminating and infuriating. Wade Thompson was a 34-year-old real estate broker who specialized in luxury properties throughout the Dallas-Fort Worth area, operating out of a high-end firm that catered to wealthy clients seeking million-dollar homes and investment properties. His professional headshots showed a conventionally handsome man with perfectly styled hair, expensive suits, and the kind of confident smile that probably worked well on clients looking to spend serious money. Rodriguez's investigation revealed that Wade had a documented pattern of targeting married women during his real estate career, particularly those going through relationship difficulties or showing signs of marital dissatisfaction. He'd been investigated twice by his real estate board for inappropriate relationships with clients, though no formal disciplinary action had been taken due to lack of concrete evidence. Several former colleagues described him as charming but manipulative, someone who used his access to wealthy households to identify vulnerable targets for personal relationships that always seemed to coincide with expensive divorces. The timeline of Wade and Grace's relationship painted a picture of calculated seduction that had been building for over a year. They'd first met when Grace contacted his firm about potentially investing in rental properties, something she'd mentioned to me as a way to diversify our income beyond the boutique. Wade had apparently positioned himself as her financial advisor and mentor, gradually convincing her that I was holding her back from achieving real wealth and status. Security footage from upscale restaurants showed their relationship progressing from business lunches to intimate dinners, with Wade clearly orchestrating Grace's growing dissatisfaction with our marriage. What made Wade's manipulation particularly insidious was how he'd systematically reinforced Grace's insecurities about money and social status. According to text messages Rodriguez had recovered from Grace's cloud backup, Wade had spent months telling her she deserved better than a middle-class programmer, and that women like her were meant for luxury lifestyles funded by men who understood real success. He'd convinced her that divorce settlement money would give her the financial independence to start fresh with someone who truly appreciated her worth. The most disturbing aspect of Wade's character became clear when Rodriguez investigated his financial background and discovered a pattern of gambling addiction and mounting debts. Wade owed substantial money to several high-end casinos and had been using credit cards and personal loans to maintain his expensive lifestyle while working toward bigger scores. The investigator found evidence that Wade had been using Grace's credit cards for expensive trips and luxury purchases, apparently with her permission but clearly without her understanding of his true financial situation. Rodriguez's surveillance revealed that Wade was simultaneously maintaining relationships with at least 2 other women, both of whom appeared to be wealthy and potentially going through marital difficulties. He'd been photographed having intimate dinners with a doctor's wife from Plano and an attorney's wife from Highland Park, apparently running the same playbook on multiple targets. The expensive restaurants, the luxury hotel rooms, the designer gifts, Wade was living well beyond his means by exploiting women who thought they'd found someone who could provide the lifestyle they believed they deserved. Bank records that Rodriguez obtained through legal channels showed Wade had maxed out Grace's personal credit cards over the past 3 months, racking up over $80,000 in charges for luxury vacations, high-end electronics, and cash advances that had apparently funded his gambling habits. Grace had no idea she was essentially financing Wade's addiction while he promised her a future of financial security and social advancement. The man who'd convinced her to leave her stable marriage for a better life was systematically destroying her credit and financial stability while planning his own exit strategy. The investigators' final report included evidence that Wade had already begun distancing himself from Grace as her divorce proceedings approached, apparently recognizing that her settlement might not materialize as planned and that her usefulness as a financial resource was diminishing. Phone records showed his calls to Grace had decreased dramatically over the past 2 weeks, and surveillance indicated he was spending more time with his other targets while making excuses to avoid seeing Grace. The classic pattern of a predator preparing to abandon one victim while securing others suggested that Grace's dream of a wealthy new life was about to become a nightmare of debt and abandonment. The formal mediation took place in a sterile conference room at Grace's attorney's downtown office, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Dallas skyline that Grace kept glancing at like she was already envisioning her new life. She arrived wearing a designer dress I'd never seen before, probably purchased with one of Wade's credit card sprees, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed victory was guaranteed. Jessica Morrison, her attorney, was exactly what I'd expected: sharp, expensive, and clearly accustomed to maximizing settlements for wives who'd decided their husbands weren't worth keeping. Grace's opening statement was a masterpiece of entitlement wrapped in victim language. She talked about the sacrifices she'd made for our marriage, the career opportunities she'd passed up to support my success, and her need for financial security to rebuild her life after our irreconcilable differences. Morrison presented a detailed breakdown of what they considered our marital assets, complete with professional valuations and projected settlement amounts that would have left Grace with over $1.2 million while I retained responsibility for most of our joint debts. The moment I'd been waiting for arrived when my attorney, David Kim, presented our counterdocumentation with the calm professionalism of someone delivering routine legal papers. Your Honor, we need to address some significant changes in asset ownership that occurred prior to the filing of divorce proceedings, he said, sliding a thick folder across the table. Morrison's confident expression faltered slightly as she began reviewing the notarized documents that detailed the trust transfers I'd completed months earlier. Grace's face went through a fascinating transformation as Morrison quietly explained what the paperwork meant. First confusion, then disbelief, then a growing horror as she realized that the house, the investment properties, and my cryptocurrency portfolio, everything she'd been counting on to fund her new life, were completely beyond her reach. The assets had been legally transferred into my father's family trust well before she'd filed for divorce, with documentation showing the moves were part of legitimate estate planning rather than attempt to hide marital property. "This can't be legal," Grace whispered, her voice breaking slightly as the reality of her situation became clear. Morrison requested an immediate recess, visibly frustrated that her client had failed to disclose any knowledge of asset transfers and had essentially wasted expensive legal fees pursuing an impossible case. I watched Grace's world crumble in real time as she frantically called Wade from the hallway, probably hoping he could provide the legal miracle or financial support she desperately needed. The recess stretched for over an hour while Morrison researched the legality of the trust arrangements and Grace made increasingly frantic phone calls that went unanswered. When they finally returned to the conference room, Grace looked like she'd been crying, and Morrison's professional demeanor had shifted from confidence to damage control. "My client would like to explore alternative settlement options," Morrison announced, essentially admitting that their original demands were no longer viable. But Grace's humiliation was just beginning. While she'd been discovering her settlement dreams were worthless, Wade had been implementing his own exit strategy with ruthless efficiency. Rodriguez texted me updates throughout the mediation process, confirming that Wade had cleaned out Grace's remaining credit accounts, opened several new cards using her information, and purchased a one-way ticket to Las Vegas with cash advances that pushed her total debt over $95,000. By the time Grace realized her affair partner had vanished, he was already 3 states away with her financial future in ruins. The final blow came when Grace's phone buzzed with a notification from her credit monitoring service. She glanced at it during our resumed mediation session, and I watched her face go completely white as she read about unauthorized charges and account closures that meant Wade had stolen not just her money, but her identity and creditworthiness. Her attorney was still trying to negotiate some form of settlement when Grace suddenly stood up, mumbled something about feeling sick, and rushed out of the conference room without another word. Grace's carefully constructed world collapsed completely within 2 weeks of our failed mediation. Wade had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a trail of financial destruction and several other women who discovered they weren't his only romantic interests. Grace lost her upscale downtown apartment when she couldn't make rent payments that had been inflated by her attempts to maintain the lifestyle Wade had convinced her she deserved. The landlord had no sympathy for her sob story about fraud and identity theft, especially when she couldn't provide any legal documentation of Wade's crimes or her status as a victim. Moving in with her sister Kelly in Fort Worth was perhaps the most humiliating aspect of Grace's downfall, given how she'd spent years looking down on Kelly's modest suburban lifestyle and middle-class husband. Kelly worked as a nurse and lived in a 3-bedroom ranch house with her family, the kind of simple, practical life that Grace had always considered beneath her aspirations. Now Grace was sleeping on Kelly's fold-out couch, surrounded by her designer clothes and expensive handbags that served as bitter reminders of the fantasy life she'd been living on borrowed money and stolen time. The boutique failed spectacularly within 8 weeks of Grace's personal crisis, as creditors seized inventory and equipment to cover the debts Wade had accumulated using her business credit accounts. Grace had been so focused on her divorce settlement and new relationship that she'd neglected the store's actual operations, letting vendor payments slide while Wade convinced her that her settlement money would solve all financial problems. When customers stopped coming and suppliers demanded immediate payment, Grace discovered that Wade had been using her business accounts as his personal ATM for months. Grace's desperate attempts to contact me began with formal letters through her attorney, evolving into personal texts, voicemails, and eventually showing up at places where she thought she might find me. Her early messages tried to frame her affair as a temporary mistake caused by confusion and Wade's manipulation, claiming she'd been victimized by a predatory man who'd taken advantage of her vulnerable state. "David, I know how this looks, but I was completely manipulated by someone who saw me as an easy target," she wrote in one lengthy text. "Wade convinced me that you didn't appreciate me, but I realize now that he was just using me to get to our money." As her financial situation became more desperate, Grace's messages shifted from explanations to outright begging for assistance with the mounting debts Wade had created in her name. She offered to sign away all future claims to my assets in exchange for help with credit card payments, student loans Wade had taken out using her information, and legal fees for the identity theft case that was going nowhere. "I'll give you a complete divorce with no settlement demands if you can just help me get out from under this debt," she pleaded in a voicemail that lasted over 3 minutes. "I know I don't deserve your help, but I don't have anyone else to turn to." Her final attempt at reconciliation came through Kelly, who called me 6 months after our divorce was finalized to say that Grace was considering bankruptcy and was genuinely sorry for everything that had happened. "She's really learned her lesson, David," Kelly said, clearly uncomfortable with being put in the middle of our situation. "She realizes now that Wade was just using her, And she keeps saying you were the best thing that ever happened to her. Kelly mentioned that Grace had started therapy and was working at a retail job in Fort Worth, trying to rebuild her life from nothing while dealing with the legal consequences of Wade's financial crimes. I listened politely to Kelly's plea for forgiveness and reconciliation, then explained calmly that Grace had made her choices with full knowledge of the consequences and that I'd moved on completely. By that point, I'd already relocated to Austin, started a new position with a tech startup, and was dating someone who appreciated stability and honesty over expensive restaurants and designer handbags. My new life was everything my marriage to Grace had never been: peaceful, authentic, and built on mutual respect rather than financial dependency and manipulation. The last I heard about Grace came through mutual friends who mentioned she'd moved somewhere out of state after declaring bankruptcy and losing her legal battle to recover any money from Wade's schemes. Apparently, she'd learned a valuable lesson about choosing partners based on their character rather than their ability to fund her lifestyle fantasies, but that education had cost her everything she'd worked for and destroyed relationships that had taken years to build.